Well, Rabbi Joseph, in the church, we are in the season of Epiphany, and I am hoping you can spark a few epiphanies for us. So we have some questions, and uh, they're complicated questions, and they are uh, questions that get to the challenge of two faiths in dialogue with one another. And so I'm wondering if you could address some of these questions and help us think through them and how we might answer them.
I think analogically, uh, and that is a gift I've been given from my time in the divinity school. I went to the divinity school of the University of Chicago to study Christian theology. First time a rabbi was admitted into that realm. Do you want to be an academic? No. I've come to study in order to understand something that is not mine. First time I was called a Christ killer, I was 7 years old. I grew up being born in 1946 in a San Francisco that was cosmopolitan, but still what we would call pluralistic.
Hmm.
The anti Semitism of my life remained primarily a Christian anti Semitism. Would be later that identitarian leftist anti Semitism made my life even more complex. I learned studying that which is not mine, that certainty is not healthy for dialogue. I need to be patient when I'm experiencing another person's identity and their belief, their need to be present to certain realities that are not mine, for which I have neither vocabulary nor experience. And if the nature of the relationship is mature enough, then I ask questions. I ask permission to ask the questions. We did this early in our relationship. I took the wild risk of saying, do you invite people to the Lord's table using Luther's small catechism and on the night he was betrayed? Some Christians are not aware of what that idiom, and on the night he was betrayed, what that says even today about Jews. I don't hear many people calling Jews Christ killers anymore. But I do hear people misusing words like Pharisee,
Yeah.
which
Yeah,
has
yeah.
a definition of hypocrite. So I want to begin to respond to people who took the time and effort to make a comment about our last podcast. But I want to do it in that construct of complexity over and against certainty.
Hmm.
I'm responding because all notes had a certainty about them with which I can't relate. If
So
our
give us an example of where you hear that
so
note
um,
of certainty.
the moral condemnation that we assign to the Holocaust must be leveled at the destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. It misuses a word, misapplies its historical realm, and there is a certainty to that equivalency. The devastation to the Palestinian people is horrific. I do not support the military strategy that has been used to dismantle Hamas. I'm a retired 77-year-old professor and rabbi. I don't understand military strategy. I don't know why this has been necessary. I too believe the Palestinian people who live in Gaza are hostages and remain hostages of a terrorist organization that governs their area.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned two things over the last 2 days that complicates this. A friend told me over coffee that he had a cousin who went from New York to Israel to volunteer, to do labor. And where he was volunteering, the siren blew. They had been told, you have 20 seconds. A rocket has been seen, heard, run to the bunker. He had not been trained. How do you run? Where do you run? He panicked. He ran. He fell. He hit his head. He died.
It's terrible.
I was told by a young Israeli rabbi today of an argument he has every Friday in determining whether or not to have Sabbath services inside the bunker or in a hall, the sanctuary. The problem is that in order to get all those who have gathered for the Sabbath to the bunker means steps. On a previous Shabbat, Sabbath, he had to help a Holocaust survivor in a wheelchair to get to the bunker. I don't know what that means. I literally don't know what it means to determine Friday night after Friday night. Well, do you think there will be any sirens this Friday night? That is the normative realm of a little new form synagogue outside Tel Aviv. That's complicated. That there is no certainty to that. And what I'm asking in our experience, in our new interfaith realization, is that we give each other a margin of a complicated life. I am not defending the devastation of the Palestinian people. The comments don't mention Hamas. They mention the Palestinian people. This is not a war against the Palestinian people. And yes, the Palestinian people have paid a horrific price. The leader of Hamas is now in a bunker with hostages in order that he not be killed or captured. Another note. We can't confuse hate for the Jews for hate for the Israeli government and their apartheid. The uproar post October 7th is the result of people around the world finally seeing what the Palestinians have experienced for the past 75 years. I cannot argue about the plight of the Palestinians when the moral equivalency is used to justify the massacre on October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
There is something much more complex when a terrorist organization intentionally does what it did. The rape, the beheading of infants, it is far more ghastly than 75 years of Israeli governments. But excuse me, in 1947, the United Nations partitioned a piece of land that had been part of the Ottoman Empire. Part of the land was given to Jews, part of the land was given to Arabs, a group of people who would ultimately then be called Palestinians. I am willing to argue as a Jew, as a Zionist, as a friend of Christians. What has happened to that people is absolutely historically unconscionable. What I'm not prepared to argue is that a terrorist organization embedded in that people can commit a massacre on October 7th because of the past 75 years. That's not a conversation I will participate in. There are boundaries. If you don't call me Christ killer, but you do think I'm a hypocrite and I won't be in heaven, how far has our dialogue gotten?
Mhm.
And another one who makes it even more difficult regarding the salient lessons of the Holocaust and writes October 7th was horrible, outrageous, unjustifiable, but it was one day in history that is being used to explicitly justify 3 unrelenting months of slaughter. How many days would have been permitted? This is a war to dismantle Hamas. It is not a war to destroy Palestinian life. And yes, Palestinian lives have been destroyed. Most numbers now consider a minimum of a third of the numbers being used are combatants for Hamas.
Mm.
We Jews and Christians have argued for centuries about language. You and I have had just a common moment of, is it Hebrew scripture or Old Testament? Do I or don't I need the salvationary love of a Christ risen on the third day? Is the covenant of Torah still abiding in my life? Can we talk about our God, without then blaming each other for the times in which we're living? And we haven't even added the complexity of Islam, Muslims, and the division in Islam that requires a jihad for the realization of Islamic faith. So,
I mean, one of the things that occurs to me listening to you talk is one of the things that's problematic in talking about October 7th and th- this dialogue in general and current events is that very often, intentionally or subconsciously, Christians and the church, Big C, puts itself in the position of moral arbiter between Jews and Muslims, which is an inappropriate place for us to occupy.
look, um, I don't know how the intractable problems that Israel as a modern nation state and her partners, I don't know how this gets solved. This is not Northern Ireland. This is not the former Czech Yugoslavia. This is a unique set of issues. The current government of Israel must be taken down. The future of the whole area is dependent on a more pluralistic, democratic, engaged among the people government. But the cover of the New Yorker this week is a satiric, anguished figure of Donald Trump as a goose stepping authoritarian leader. Is it funny? Is it satire? Or is it a tragic comedy about which we're all still waiting for something to be real? The times in which we live in my 77 years don't have a precedent. What does it mean when a former president uses the word hostage? The hostages have not yet been returned, in reference to those who committed crimes, had trials, convicted, and sentenced. Please, please save what we mean when we say it. Save it.
I don't. Well, and then not to get partisan, but Elise Stefanik then repeated that word on Sunday morning,
So did Michael Johnson.
And it's not accidental.
No.
Um,
And so if we can't be in dialogue with a vocabulary that we trust, what has happened to the Palestinian people is horrific. It is not genocide. It is not the Holocaust. October 7th is not just one day in history. Let's be fair to each other. The Jews have one little place that is theirs, historically, theologically, textually, legally. Now, they are accountable for how they live there. Fine. Hold them accountable for how they live there. But let's use language that we can share. And so these comments stir in me, have we done enough work just in securing the vocabulary we trust?
and that's so much harder given how siloed our information sources are. It's harder because you know you're not you're not going to happen across someone in a United Methodist congregation that would call you a Christ killer. However, um, you probably would encounter someone who uh, awkwardly says something that is cringy and anti-Semitic without realizing it, because the church does a bad job of forming people around this particular relationship. Um, it's difficult.
Pluralism is messy. It isn't just a straight line. I want to be present to the reality of someone who is loved, and they know they are loved because on the third day the Messiah rose for their salvation. I don't want to make that an equivocal relative truth. I want to be present to that experience. It's not my experience.
So um, that raises. So I just started. Um, I'm going to do uh, a Lectio Continua series through the Elijah narrative in the Book of Kings, um, and Elijah appears out of nowhere in First Kings 17, right? Uh, in King Ahab's council chambers, and the dramatic tension in this narrative is the history of Israel's kings tolerating other gods, co-opting them, endorsing them, making them part of the national apparatus. So, how do you distinguish between wanting to exist in a pluralistic culture and society with uh, one of the main threads of the Hebrew Bible is this, you know, the God of Israel over and against all the false gods?
There is this inherent flaw in monotheism. It is an exclusivist faith.
Hmm.
We don't talk about that very often.
But thus the persecution.
Um, if there were a group in the current identitarian conversations, would they want to get up and say, on behalf of those polytheists, those idol worshiping religional people? Yeah, there's no question. For those of us for whom scripture means something, idol worshippers are used as the consistent foil from Genesis 12 on. You can't be a monotheist and include. Okay, Christianity and Islam have the same problem, but they double down on exclusion by also excluding that which preceded them. I think we're idol worshippers. I think our idols come in the form of little cards. How many idols do you carry in your wallet? I think we are idol worshippers in the mode and nature of the technology we carry with us. Look, I can't imagine how easy it was. Easy. I don't understand an Elijah who then had to go up against all of the Baal cult. What was he thinking? Really? You're going to do them all at once? Religion requires a passion, something for which there is no rational undergirding.
I think Nick Cave calls religion spirituality with rigor.
Okay. You and I are both called to serve. This is a idiot's profession. Nobody rationally chooses to serve as a clergy person. We sell notions. We attempt to interpret tradition that at its best seems hackneyed. And we serve people at a moment of intimacy when their vulnerability is linked into what our faith communities want to help them do to get across this moment of life's intersections. And then finally, they say, oh, I'm not quite sure your theology institutionally meets my standards today. I prefer the drive-through menu Then the institutional menu. Okay. Elijah is one of very few figures that doesn't die. What happens? He goes and comes back as the harbinger of the messianic age. He will bring penultimately the announcement. We both hold on to that. We have a cup on the Seder table that is full and no one takes a sip. After the meal, we open the door to greet Elijah. Will Elijah come this year? We look to see if there's anything left from the top of the cup. We both are still waiting. It is the not yetness of our institutional promises where we share the most.
Mhm.
I don't spend much time anymore worrying about idolatry. I don't, but I think I should. I think idolatry continues to be what is shiny, whatever moves quickly to distract me from the complexity. But it's difficult to use that word without losing people because
Well,
it is
yeah,
so.
it's an antiquated word,
That's it.
perhaps, but it's I think it's a profound mistake to assume that idolatry functioned in the Old Testament any different than the way it does today.
I don't know. There's something much simpler about having little clay idols meeting the experiential needs of the moment. Rain, too much sun, no snow. Okay, I line them up. What is it that you need? The unseen, unseeable God who redeems for the purpose of responsible, accountable life. That's a harder sell, Jason.
Oh, well, I mean, we live at a time when thousands of people dress up in political movement costumes for for a particular personality, a personality who put out a commercial over the weekend, speaking of himself in idolatrous ways. I mean, that's just um, that's just a fact, and that's just what it is.
What we're attempting to model is something that is today in the marketplace of ideas ignored, an ongoing conversation
Hmm.
in which neither of us, you speak for yourself, I have no agenda. I show up every week for the sake of the conversation, to be present, to listen, to learn, maybe offer a moment. This takes more time because time is not the issue.
Yeah. Well, it's um, so uh, I'm doing this series through the Elijah narrative, um, and one of the reasons I prefer to preach a chunk of scripture at a time is because almost on a weekly basis, the Revised Common Lectionary that a lot of mainline and Catholic churches use is a 3 year schedule of readings. Um, Pairs an Old Testament text with a gospel reading or an epistle from the New Testament, um, and pairs them in such a way uh, to show how the passage from the New fulfills the Old.
Yep.
And so the Old Testament passage is rarely treated as authoritative in the same way that it was for the apostles, and that's
They,
problematic.
yeah, the institution is still committed to the nature of its own survival. And therefore, let's make sure that from which we came is proven to be no longer necessary.
Hmm.
There has to be a better product for which we are responsible.
Yeah, well, because I don't know that Christians appreciate that. You know, well, the church existed for almost 2 centuries, and the only scripture they had was what you call the Old Testament. Um, so,
I
so
don't
if
call it the Old. You call it the Old Testament.
yeah,
I
but
call it the
so
Bible.
um, so if we're going to talk about the authority of Scripture, like these are the texts that we need to revere first, and everything else was occasional.
And they're texts that we're sharing.
Hmm.
And I think every now and then we have to come back and work on that.
Hmm.
I think there's a great deal of assumption that we can share. No, we're not sharing. You used the word silo before. Yes, that is definitely a product of over specialization,
Hmm.
identity politics. We've lost a moment where we can simply be together and share.
And this is something that you know, folks who've been to seminary and graduate school might understand, and lay folks might not understand what we're talking about. But I do think in academic biblical studies departments, they rightly are so wary of supersessionist readings of scripture
Mm-hmm.
that they accidentally disempower students from saying anything at all. And the result of that is actually a lack of dialogue.
Correct.
So I think the over specialization of scripture studies and trying to avoid the mistakes of the past just creates silence. And whereas, so you, Rabbi, as a Jew, may be uncomfortable with some of the ways, for example, that the ancient church fathers read the Hebrew Bible. But
There's no question.
the creative way they read the Hebrew Bible actually creates space for dialogue. Um, these allegorical, Christological readings, versus just a purely academic, historical, critical method that kind of shuts down conversation.
I've just finished a chapter. If you have time, I'd love to send it to you for your comments on Exodus 3:14. Just one verse and the problem of translation. What
Mm.
I call the inscrutable, unpronounceable, untranslatable problem, as read through some of Paul Ricoeur's work. There
So for
was a
give listeners the verse.
Exodus 3:14 where God and Moses engage through the Malach, the messenger of God in the burning bush. And God calls Moses, and Moses says, I'm going to go. How shall I call you? What is your name? That they will know I've spoken to you. Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah. Uh, Tragically destroyed by the King James Version, I am that I am. Oh my, please. Oh my God. It's not possible grammatically. Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah. First person future, imperfect.
Hmm.
The least it could be is I am that I am. I much prefer more complexity. I am that which I have yet to become. But what
Yeah.
I really prefer is please leave it untranslated. Leave it untranslated for the unique moment of textual mystery. This text was oral, 4 centuries before it was written. In Exodus 3:15, we actually get the quote tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He Yahweh, which was only pronounced once a year inside the Holy of Holies by the high priest. And it was so terrifying, they had to put a rope around his ankle to pull him out in case something happened. We were talking about idolatry. This is the unseen, unseeable God. Do you really think the only time God utters God's own name, it can be so simple as to be, I am that I am?
Which I think maybe I've said this before, but so the Christian Bible, the two Testaments, uh, is quote unquote a library of many different books. Um, it's and it can be bewildering how they're all connected. But one of the ways that it all hangs together is by this constant movement to correctly call upon the name of God.
Right.
Um, and therefore, and so you may not call on the Lord with the word Jesus, but the importance of the name abides across Scripture as the narrative thread that holds it together. And therefore, if that's the main thrust, if that's the spine of Scripture, um, at the very least, people of faith should not be engaging current issues and events, taking the name of the Lord lightly or for granted.
I'm all for not knowing what to say. When I began today, it was out of the pain of those who wrote, out of their own pain, but it was the certainty with which they wrote that provoked my answer. I'm not certain about anything, especially after October 7th. So,
Well, and we talked about idolatry. I think one of the replacement religions in our culture is public performance on social media,
mhm.
and the lure of having a take immediately on everything. And so our these platforms sort us into like-minded tribes where we it's demanded of us that we express certainty as immediately as possible.
Well said. That's a gift today for me. Thank you, Jason. I think quasi public certainty is absolutely a new idol. Yes. And it comes at a time where disinformation, the intentional denial of reality, influences how that idol is embraced.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
And at a time where, okay, let's not put limits on anything because a guy was a really good quarterback, he gets to go on national TV podcasts and just make up. No, 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 no. There are some things that simply, no, your opinion about that is not needed. I worry that if we don't know how to have a conversation with differences, if we can't listen to something you don't understand, you've never experienced, you're not sure of, that means you don't have an answer for it.
Hmm.
I don't know. there is a humility that I think Elijah requires. I don't know what he was thinking when he decided to go against all the idols. What does that
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, well, and there's, you know, I think also one more anthropological and less theological way of reading that story. The first part of that story is, um, after the chutzpah moment of confronting King Ahab, um, God then humbles him by sending him out into the wilderness and then sending him to
Yeah.
a Gentile widow. That maybe that's to uh, course correct Elijah's self image.
Can I hope for something for which there is neither proof nor justification? Is there something aspirational about the unique figure of Elijah, who, by the way, quote, as a prophet, does not have his own book?
Hmm.
He's stuck, as it were, in Kings. In the same way, Nathan is stuck in the book of Samuel.
Yeah.
Um, look, I don't know. I don't know how to help people disengage from the allure of certainty. I think you're absolutely correct. As I sit here, yes, you're correct. That is part of our idolatrous problem today. And we are not helping people when we don't say directly to them, no, that's wrong. It's not a different opinion. It's wrong. I'm not sure what interfaith relations globally will look like after October 7th. I am very fearful of a new sweep of anti-Islam. And I don't use the word Islamophobia because the word Islamophobia means fear of Muslims. There is a hatred
Hmm.
of Islam and a misunderstanding of its cultural legal texts, which Muslim terrorists use to help divide and confuse the West. I don't want to participate in anything that further divides a fragile remnant that I counted on most of my career and
It seems,
active
yeah.
engagement.
I mean, you mentioning anti-Islam and the Muslim ban being back in the news and seemingly normalized. Um, and I was thinking of Liz Cheney's comment over the weekend about uh, how we're sleepwalking into a dictatorship, um, and and so it's this odd mix where we are all. It is demanded of us to have certainty over different issues and public questions, and at the same time, we're incredibly unserious. Um,
Mm.
and 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 so I don't know. It's hard to really know what time it is, so to speak.
Well said. Um, a part of the problem with contemporary idolatry and the shininess and the distraction and the noise making is we lose track of time. It isn't that we just don't know what time it is. We've lost track of time. Is it too late? I've been waiting since 2016 for the trapdoor to open, and no, okay, you've gone too far. No, this is truly the end. How can a former president of the United States equate hostages being taken in Gaza? To use that word today with those who committed crimes and went through the system of justice, were convicted and sentenced, and they're not hostages.
Yeah, it's
There
well,
is something.
that's what I was trying to say, that there's a moral flattening of everything, and we
Mhm.
all, and you know us Gentiles at least kind of just like, oh yeah, par for the course. There's a lack of alarm, a lack of disgust, and a lack
Thank you.
of reproach.
Yep.
Um,
And so you can say that October 7th is the way the world learns of what has happened to Palestinians over 75 years. No, no, please, no, no, don't. We're trying something. Our experiment on a weekly basis is to be present to difference without feeling diminished, so that there has to be some kind of verbal upsmanship.
mhm, yeah,
Does that have to do not just with the idolatry of certainty, but the exhaustion of the rapidity of life today?
hmm yeah, I think that's a thing too.
And Elijah is one of those fascinating examples of someone who did a lot, but he must have taken time out to just reflect about it, to think about what he was doing.
Yeah, I've thought too about Elijah and Elisha. Um, that despite despite the word of the Lord leaving Israel and going out into the wilderness with Elijah, despite Ahab and Jezebel, despite the unfaithfulness of the people, um, they never entertain the illusion that their vocation is just for a faithful remnant of Jews, that they still have this obligation to care for uh, the public, uh, the Commonwealth, however you want to phrase it, and um, and that is part of the quote unquote Judeo-Christian ethic, right? Like we do have a responsibility um, to the communities of which we're a part, and so
I think
like
it
we can't you can't retreat into some sort of spiritual realm. You have, like, the commandments are such that you have to give a shit about where you live and who your neighbors are.
we stood in the desert, and the people of Israel responded, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do, and then we will understand. And that doesn't seem to be in the right order. Don't you normally try to understand something in order to do it? But it is exactly what's meant. We do in order then ultimately to understand. We are committed. That's what leaving Egypt meant. You get freedom, you don't get liberty.
Hmm.
Freedom is a responsible relationship in the community. I think that's what I'm about. I don't know how well I've done. Others determine that. But when I read the comments, I was pleased people were taking the issue seriously, and also terrified about, should I ask you, can I respond? And what would it be if I didn't respond? And what if I anger more people in responding? Yes, that's the complexity of taking the risks we're taking. And there are people who are not writing comments who are even angrier than commented. I'm certain of it. Because the times are more complex than any of us can figure out.
Yeah.
I'm going to think for the next several days what my young colleague in Israel must go through. This Friday night, where will we hold services if a siren blows because rockets are coming? Are any of us safe?
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we can't struggle with, yes, that is the default reality for Israelis who, given the accountability of the contemporary world, have not done well enough with the Palestinians. They should be held accountable for that. Does that include a justification for massacre? I'm sorry, it doesn't. We need the opportunity to engage and wonder about what Elijah represents, not just back then, but to us.
Mm-hmm.
That I can hold aspirationally, even in all of the issues we're facing. There's a time beyond time when parents and children will be finally united. It's an eschatological promise. I won't be there to understand what it means. But I hold on to the promise. I need the promise.
Yeah. Well, Joseph, thank you for your time.
Jason, thank you for the conversation. I'm going to send you a book my friend Dennis Matt wrote about Elijah.
Oh, okay.
I think you will rejoice in the new ideas.
That would be good. Yeah, that would be good.
Good.